The cargo sled came in low over the station landing pad, just as the twin moons of Voreth were rising, casting pale orange light across the dusty ground. It moved slowly, heavily, the way something moves when it is carrying a weight that cannot be rushed. Dr. Calvin Marsh was outside finishing his evening walk when he heard it. He was a lean man with calm eyes and unhurried hands, the kind of person who moved through the world without needing to announce himself. He had been working at the Voreth Wildlife Rescue Station for 3 years, long enough to know that late arrivals rarely brought good news. He stood and watched as the sled settled onto the pad with a deep mechanical groan. The traders who stepped off it were a mixed group. 2 broad-shouldered Kathrani with their flat gray faces and 4 arms each, and a smaller reptilian alien named Doss, who ran cargo routes through the outer ridge territories. They looked tired. They looked like people who had made a long trip and were ready to hand their problem to someone else. Calvin walked over slowly. "What did you bring?" he asked. Doss pointed back at the sled without looking at it. "Found her near the collapsed ridge at Sector 9. She was already like this when we got there. We thought she might be worth something to the station, maybe for records, maybe for research." Calvin stepped around them and looked at the sled. What he saw stopped him for a moment. She was enormous. Even lying down and barely moving, the dragon took up nearly the full length of the cargo sled. Her scales were a deep red-brown, the color of old volcanic rock, and many of them were cracked and burned at the edges. Her wings were folded tight against her body in the way that large creatures fold inward when they are in serious pain. Her breathing came in slow, uneven pulls, each one a small effort. Calvin had seen injured animals his whole life. He knew, without needing a scanner, that this creature was dying. Coordinator Lix arrived behind him a moment later, clicking his way across the pad on 4 of his 6 limbs. Lix was the station director, experienced, efficient, and deeply practical in the way that came from running a rescue facility at the edge of known space for 20 years. He looked at the dragon for exactly 4 seconds. "Fire Ridge Dragon," he said quietly. "Last recorded sighting in this region was 11 years ago. Her injuries are too severe. There is nothing we can do for wounds like these." He paused and then added in a flat voice, "Terminal observation. We make her comfortable, that is all." A couple of the alien staff had come out by now. They stood back from the sled at a respectful distance, watching. Nobody moved toward the dragon. Nobody reached for a medical kit. Calvin understood why. A creature this size, this badly hurt, this close to the end, experienced handlers learned quickly that some fights were already finished before they started. Getting attached only made the work harder. He accepted that. He had made peace with it a long time ago. He pulled out his scanner and began a slow, careful walk around the sled. Not to find a treatment, Lix was right about that, but because it was his habit to see clearly whatever was in front of him. He noted the burn patterns, the impact fractures along her left flank, the way her breathing had a slight catch in it every 3rd cycle. He was almost at the far end of the sled when he stopped. There was a shape beneath her wing, small, pressed tight against her side. He crouched down slowly and looked closer. It was a hatchling. Tiny, no bigger than a medium-sized dog, with the same dark red-brown scales as its mother, but softer, newer, not yet hardened by the world. Its small chest was moving in quick, shallow breaths. It had one eye partly open, watching nothing and everything at the same time, the way very young creatures do when they are not yet sure what the world is. Calvin stayed very still. After a moment, he stood up and turned to the group behind him. "There is a hatchling under her wing," he said. The reaction was not what he expected. The 2 Kathrani traders stepped back. Doss made a low sound and turned his face away. Even 2 of the station staff, both experienced alien handlers, shifted uncomfortably on their feet. Lix looked at Calvin with an expression that was not unkind. "Yes," he said. "We saw it." "What happens to it?" Calvin asked. There was a short silence. One of the alien staff members, a tall, insect-bodied worker named Fett, spoke quietly. "In the tradition of most cultures in this region, A hatchling whose mother dies before it is named carries bad fortune. No handler will take it willingly. No facility will log it as a ward. He paused. At sunrise, it will be released outside the perimeter fence. The open ridge is not kind. It will not last long. Calvin looked at the hatchling again. It had not moved. It was still pressed against its mother's side, drawing whatever warmth was left from a body that was slowly going cold. He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned back to the group, and his voice was calm and plain and completely without drama. "I'll take it," he said. Nobody spoke. Calvin did not repeat himself. He did not explain or argue or ask for anyone's opinion. He simply turned back to the sled and crouched down again beside the hatchling, keeping his distance for now, just watching, just being present. Behind him, the station was perfectly silent, and the dying dragon mother, with what seemed like the last of her fading attention, turned one great dark eye slowly in the direction of the human kneeling beside her child. The station grew quiet after midnight. The traders had gone. The staff had returned to their duties or to their rest. The landing pad outside was empty now, and the 2 moons of Voreth had climbed higher in the sky, their light coming through the thin windows of the critical care bay in long, pale strips across the floor. Calvin had moved Sarath inside with the help of the station's cargo lifters. It had taken nearly an hour. Nobody volunteered to assist, but nobody stopped him either. Lix had watched from the doorway without a word, and then walked away. That was permission enough. The critical care bay was the largest room in the station, built for big creatures, with a wide floor of heat-absorbing material and walls that could be adjusted for temperature. Calvin had set the room to warm. Not hot, just warm. The kind of warmth that said, "You are safe here, even if only for a little while." He pulled a low stool close to Sarath and sat down. He was not there to treat her. He had accepted that fully. What he was there to do was watch, and listen, and record everything he could while there was still time. He set his scanner on his knee with the audio and motion sensors running and folded his hands and waited. For the first hour, very little happened. Sarath's breathing was slow and uneven. The hatchling stayed tucked beneath her wing, invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. The room made small sounds, the soft hum of the temperature system, the distant settling of the station's outer walls. Then, around the second hour, something changed. Sarath shifted her head. It was a small movement, slow and clearly painful, but deliberate. She lowered her chin until it rested on the floor just beside her tucked wing. Then she made a sound. It was low and quiet, more vibration than noise, something Calvin felt in his chest more than heard with his ears. It lasted about 4 seconds and then stopped. The hatchling moved. A tiny head appeared from beneath the edge of the wing, blinking. The hatchling looked at its mother and made a much smaller version of the same sound back. Thin, uncertain, but clearly an answer. Calvin did not move. He barely breathed. His scanner was capturing everything. What followed over the next 2 hours was the most quietly extraordinary thing Calvin had ever witnessed in 20 years of working with animals. Sarath taught. Not with words, not with anything that could be written in a textbook, but with the slow and patient language of a mother who knew exactly how much time she had left and was not going to waste a single minute of it. She produced small, controlled bursts of flame from the back of her throat, not large enough to threaten anything, just small, careful pulses, each one a different shape and duration. After each one, she would pause and look at the hatchling. The hatchling would watch, and then attempt something similar. Small, weak, unfocused little flickers, nothing like the mother's, but clearly trying. When the hatchling got something close to right, Sarath made a specific short sound. When it wandered off and started pawing at the floor instead, she made a different sound. Not sharp, not punishing, just a quiet correction that brought the small creature's attention back. She nudged the hatchling with her nose toward certain positions. She demonstrated breathing patterns, slow, deep pulls followed by controlled exhales, and waited while the hatchling copied them with its whole small body. Calvin recorded every sound, every movement, every pause, and every response. His hands were completely still. His face was unreadable. But his eyes did not leave them for a single moment. Around the third hour, Coordinator Lix appeared in the doorway. He stood there for a while, watching. Then he walked in slowly and stopped a few feet behind Calvin. "You should rest," Lix said quietly. "This changes nothing. She will not survive to morning." "I know," Calvin said. "You are recording a creature that will leave no living legacy. There is no conservation value here. The hatchling has no future in any registered program. You are spending your night on something the galaxy has already closed the book on." Calvin was quiet for a moment. On the floor, Sarath was guiding the hatchling through the breathing pattern again, slow and unhurried, as if Lix had said nothing at all. "She doesn't know that," Calvin said. "She's just doing what she can with the time she has." Lix looked at the two of them on the floor for a long moment. Then he left without another word. The fourth hour was the quietest. Sarath's movements slowed. The teaching sessions grew shorter, with longer rests in between. The hatchling seemed to sense it. It stopped wandering and stopped practicing and simply stayed close, pressed against its mother's side, very still. Calvin sat with them. He did not try to intervene. He did not try to speed anything up or slow anything down. He just stayed present in the room, close enough to be felt, far enough to leave space for what was happening between a mother and her child. Near the end of the fourth hour, Sarath lifted her head one final time. She looked at the hatchling for a long moment. Then, with great care, she nudged the small creature forward across the floor with the tip of her nose, gently, the way you hand something precious to someone you have decided to trust. The hatchling stopped directly against Calvin's hand. Calvin did not move for a moment. Then, very slowly, he turned his palm upward. The hatchling looked at his hand. Then it looked up at him. Then it made the low, quiet sound, the same one Sarath had used all night as a greeting. Calvin looked up at Sarath. Her eyes were closed. Her breathing had stopped. The room was very still. Cal sat quietly for a while. Then he reached for the thermal blanket folded on the shelf beside him, wrapped it carefully around the small creature in his hand, and spoke in a low and steady voice. "Okay, little one," he said. "Let's figure this out together." The first problem was the food. Calvin had spent the early morning hours going through every database the station had access to: galactic wildlife records, xenobiology archives, old field research logs from survey teams that had passed through the Voreth region decades ago. He searched for anything related to Fire Ridge dragons, diet, habitat, hatchling care, behavioral patterns. What he found was almost nothing. There were a few old photographs, a short observation log from a survey team that had spotted an adult from a distance and written 3 paragraphs before the creature disappeared into the ridge. A single biological sample entry from 40 years ago that gave basic scale composition data and nothing else. That was it. The galaxy had never cared enough about Fire Ridge dragons to study them properly while they were still around. Now there was one hatchling left in a thermal blanket on Calvin's work table, making small sounds every few minutes, and there was no guide in existence that could tell him what to do next. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he opened his scanner recordings from the night before and started again from the beginning. He watched Sarath's movements. He listened to every sound she had made. He noted the breathing patterns she had demonstrated, the flame exercises, the way she had positioned the hatchling close to her side for warmth rather than under her wing when the room temperature was already comfortable. He watched the way she responded when the hatchling ate, or tried to eat, nudging it toward something in her own body that Calvin could not replicate, but could try to understand chemically. He built a list. Warmth at a specific, consistent temperature. Sound at low frequencies, played softly and continuously. Physical contact. The hatchling needed to feel something solid beside it most of the time. And food that was mineral-rich, high in certain volcanic compounds that made sense given where Fire Ridge dragons lived and what the geological survey data said about the ridge territories. It was not a perfect plan. It was built from recordings and logic and a careful reading of a mother's last hours. But it was a plan, and Calvin was the kind of person who worked best when he had something specific to do. He named her Ember. He did not announce it. He did not write it on any official form. He just started using the name quietly when he was alone in the room with her. The way you name something when you want it to know it belongs somewhere. The first 2 days were hard. Ember refused to eat on the first day entirely. She sat in her thermal wrap and watched Calvin move around the room and made occasional sounds but would not touch the food he prepared. Calvin did not force it. He placed the food nearby and left it there, and went about his other work in the room, staying present without hovering, giving her time to make her own decision. On the second day, she ate a small amount. Not much, but enough. On the third day, she scorched his sleeve. It happened fast. Calvin had leaned in to check her temperature, and Ember produced a short burst of flame. Small, uncontrolled, the kind of thing a hatchling does not yet understand how to aim or stop, and caught the end of his left sleeve. It went out quickly. Calvin looked at the blackened edge of the fabric and then looked at Ember, who was staring at him with enormous eyes as if she was not entirely sure what had just happened. "That's all right," Calvin said. "Your mother did that same exercise every hour last night. You're just a little early." Ember blinked. Calvin got a new sleeve. It was on the fourth day that Dr. Nora Lane appeared. She knocked on the open door of Calvin's quarters and leaned against the frame with her arms crossed, and an expression that was equal parts professional skepticism and genuine curiosity. She was a xenobiologist, compact and direct, with short dark hair and the kind of eyes that were always doing quiet calculations. She had arrived at the station 2 days ago on a research transit stop and had heard about the hatchling from 3 different staff members before she had even finished unpacking. "I wanted to see for myself," she said. "Everyone is talking about it. Half the station thinks you've lost your mind, and the other half can't decide if what you're doing is impressive or just stubborn." "It can be both," Calvin said without looking up from his notes. Nora walked in slowly and stopped a few feet from the work table where Ember was sitting in her thermal wrap, watching the newcomer with calm, dark eyes. Nora looked at the setup, the temperature controls, the low-frequency sound emitter running in the corner, the carefully prepared food in its mineral composition, the scanner recordings playing on low on the side screen, Serath's movements on a quiet loop. She was quiet for a moment. "You built this from the recordings," she said. "Mostly," Calvin said. "Some of it is standard hatchling care logic adjusted for what I know about volcanic habitat species. Some of it is guessing." "It's working," Nora said. She said it simply, not as a compliment exactly, more as a factual observation from someone who had seen a lot of failed xenobiology fieldwork and knew what not working looked like. "So far," Calvin said. Nora pulled up a chair and sat down. She watched Ember for a while. Ember watched her back without alarm, which was itself something worth noting for a hatchling of a species with no record of human contact. "I want to document this properly," Nora said. "For the xenobiology record. A Fire Ridge hatchling surviving without its mother, raised on behavioral observation data. There is nothing like this in any archive anywhere." Calvin was quiet for a moment. "One condition," he said. Nora waited. "The primary credit goes to her mother," Calvin said. "Serath did the work. We're just following her instructions." Nora looked at him for a moment, then she nodded slowly. "Agreed," she said. In her thermal wrap on the work table, Ember made a small, low sound and tucked her chin down onto her front feet, perfectly calm, as if the matter had been settled to her satisfaction as well. 3 weeks passed. Ember grew. Not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily and visibly, the way healthy young creatures grow when they are eating well and sleeping well and living in a place that feels safe. Her scales had deepened in color, moving from the soft, uncertain red-brown of a newborn towards something richer and darker, like cooling lava just before it hardens. The soft edges of her flame crest, the small ridge of heat-sensitive tissue that ran from the top of her head down the back of her neck, had begun to show the faintest glow in the evenings, which Calvin noted carefully in his records and Nora photographed from every angle. She was also, without anyone planning it or asking for it, starting to move around. Calvin had noticed it first on a Tuesday morning when he came back from the station kitchen with his coffee and found the door to his quarters open an inch wider than he had left it. He stood in the hallway and looked at the door, and then looked down at the floor and saw the small scorch mark near the bottom edge where a tiny flame burst had been applied, experimentally, to the door mechanism. Ember was sitting in the middle of the hallway looking at him. "How did you reach the handle?" Calvin said. Ember made a low sound and walked past him toward the kitchen. After that, Calvin stopped trying to keep her in one room. It was clear she had made her own decision about that, and arguing with a Fire Ridge dragon, even a very small one, seemed like poor strategy for everyone involved. She moved through the station carefully at first, stay close to walls, stopping often to observe before moving forward. She did not make noise. She did not knock things over. She moved the way her mother had moved in those final hours, deliberately, with attention, as if every step was a small decision being made consciously. The staff did not know what to do with her. Most of them stepped aside when she came down a corridor. Some of them went a longer route to avoid passing her at all. The belief that she carried bad fortune had not disappeared simply because she was still alive and healthy. If anything, some of the alien staff seemed more unsettled by her survival than they had been by her presence. Things that were supposed to fail and did not fail made certain kinds of people deeply uncomfortable. But Ember did not seem to notice or care about any of that. She was interested in everything. She stopped at doorways and looked inside rooms. She sat near the station's main water filtration unit for an entire afternoon, watching it run, apparently finding the rhythm of it deeply satisfying. She followed the morning light as it moved across the common area floor in a long, slow stripe, moving with it, staying in the warm patch the way small creatures do when warmth means comfort and safety. And she started approaching people. Not aggressively, not with any kind of demand. She would simply appear near someone who was working, settle herself at a comfortable distance, and stay there, watching, occasionally making the low, quiet sound that Calvin had come to recognize as her general greeting. The first person she chose was Fett, the tall, insect-bodied worker who had told Calvin on the first night that no handler would take the hatchling willingly, that she would not last an hour in the wild. Fett had avoided her completely for 3 weeks, and then one morning Ember walked into the equipment storage room where Fett was doing inventory and sat down 2 feet from his work area and watched him sort cable units for an hour without making a single problem. Fett did not acknowledge her, but he did not leave either. The next day she came back. Fett was there again. This time he glanced at her once, quickly, and then went back to his work. The day after that he said to no one in particular and very quietly, "She likes the sound the inventory scanner makes." Calvin, passing in the hallway, said nothing, but he made a note. Then came Coordinator Lix. It happened on a Wednesday, mid-morning, while Lix was at his workstation going through supply request forms, which was the kind of work he did every Wednesday in the same chair at the same time with the same expression of focused irritation. He was deep in a particularly complicated fuel allocation disagreement between 2 supplier routes when he became aware, slowly, that something was sitting beside his workstation. He looked down. Ember looked up. She was not doing anything. She was not making noise. She was simply sitting there with her chin level and her dark eyes calm, watching him work with what appeared to be genuine interest in the fuel allocation problem. Lix stared at her for a long moment. Then he went back to his forms. Ember stayed for 2 hours. When she finally got up and walked away, Lix sat very still for a moment, and then typed a single line into his personal station log that he did not share with anyone. "The hatchling sat with me this morning. She was good company." Nora saw all of it. She was documenting everything now, filling pages of xenobiological observation notes with a quiet intensity that reminded Calvin of the way Sarath had spent her last hours, using the time available, wasting none of it. One evening she came to Calvin with her notes open and said, "I think we have the species classification wrong. Fire Ridge dragons were never solitary predators. The old records assumed that because the adults were rarely seen together, but Ember's behavior suggests deep social instinct. She is not approaching these people because she is tame. She is approaching them because she is doing what her species was always meant to do. She is building a group. Calvin looked at Ember, who was currently sitting on the observation platform railing watching the sunset with the focused attention of someone who took sunsets seriously. Sereth was doing the same thing, he said quietly. In her last hours, she wasn't just teaching Ember how to survive, she was teaching her how to belong somewhere. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she wrote that down too. The following week, a transport ship arrived carrying 3 representatives from the Regional Alien Conservation Council. They had heard about the surviving Fire Ridge hatchling through the Xenobiology Network and had come to assess the situation personally. They stepped off their ship with official expressions and data tablets and the careful, neutral faces of people who had learned not to form opinions before collecting evidence. Within 4 hours, all 3 of them had eaten their lunch in the common area with Ember sitting quietly nearby, and one of them had absent-mindedly reached down and placed his hand flat on the floor when Ember approached, the way you offer a hand to an animal you have decided you are not afraid of anymore. Ember touched her nose to his palm, made her low greeting sound, and walked on. The council member sat very still for a moment. Then he looked at his 2 colleagues and said nothing. But his expression had changed completely. Later that evening, he found Calvin on the observation platform and stood beside him in the cooling air and asked the question that had clearly been sitting in him all day. "How did you know to try?" he said. "Everyone here had already decided. The traders, the staff, the coordinator, everyone had already made their conclusion. How did you know to go against all of that?" Calvin thought about it for a moment, looking out at the darkening ridge in the distance, at the place where Sarath had been found, broken and burning and carrying something small beneath her wing. "I didn't know," he said. "I just didn't think it was my place to decide she wasn't worth the effort." The council member was quiet for a long time after that. Behind them, through the open platform door, they could hear the soft, low sound of Ember moving through the station, steady and calm, doing the quiet work of belonging to a place that had not wanted her, and changing it, slowly, one small approach at a time. The council meeting took place on a Friday morning. It was held in the station's main conference room, which was not a large or impressive space, just a long table, some chairs built for different body types, and a wall screen that flickered slightly on the left side if you ran too many programs at once. But the 3 Conservation Council representatives sat at that table with their data tablets and their official seals and their careful faces, and what they said in that room mattered, because what they said became part of the permanent galactic record. Calvin sat across from them. Nora sat beside him with her documentation files stacked neatly in front of her. Coordinator Lix sat at the far end of the table, quiet and composed, his 6 limbs folded in the way that meant he was paying close attention. Ember was not in the room. She was somewhere in the station doing whatever she had decided to do that morning, which was her habit now, and which nobody argued with anymore. The lead council representative, a tall, gray-skinned alien named Orath, opened the session by reading the official status that Fire Ridge dragons had carried for the past 11 years. Functionally extinct in the Voreth region. No confirmed living specimens. No active conservation program. Case considered closed pending any new evidence. He looked up from his tablet. "We have new evidence," he said. What followed was 2 hours of careful, thorough review. Nora presented her documentation, weeks of behavioral observation, the nutritional data Calvin had developed, the recorded sessions from Sarath's final hours that had made all of it possible. She spoke clearly and without exaggeration, laying out the facts in the plain language of someone who trusted the facts to speak for themselves. Calvin answered questions when they were directed at him. He gave precise answers and did not add anything unnecessary. He was not uncomfortable in the room, but he was clearly more at ease in the care bay than in a conference, and anyone watching could see that the formal setting mattered much less to him than the work it was meant to recognize. At the end of the 2 hours, Orath set his tablet down and looked at both of them. "The Council will reclassify Fire Ridge dragons in the Voreth region," he said. From functionally extinct to active conservation status. Single known juvenile, human-assisted. The record will be updated across all galactic wildlife databases within 30 days. Nora exhaled slowly. She had been holding that breath for weeks without fully realizing it. Calvin nodded once. Then Orath said something that nobody in the room had expected. Additionally, he said, the Council would like to present the Galactic Veterinary Service Award to Dr. Calvin Marsh for extraordinary care of an endangered species under conditions of significant institutional resistance and zero available precedent. It is one of the highest recognitions our Council can offer. The room was quiet for a moment. Calvin looked at the table. Then he looked up at Orath, and his expression was polite and genuine and completely calm. "Thank you," he said. "I'm glad to hear it, but I'd like to make a request instead." Orath waited. "There is no named entry in the Galactic Wildlife Conservation Ledger for the individual animal who made this possible," Calvin said. "Sarath, the mother. She is recorded only as a specimen. Species, location, date of death, nothing else." He paused. "She spent her last hours teaching her hatchling everything she could pass on. She made a decision about who to trust with her child. Without what she did in those hours, there would be nothing to document, no conservation status to reclassify, no award to give." He looked at Orath steadily. "I'd like her to have a named entry. Individual, acknowledged, permanent. Not as a specimen, as the animal she actually was." The three council representatives looked at each other. It was not a standard request. The Galactic Conservation Ledger recorded species, populations, and events. It did not, as a rule, record individuals. Not animals, anyway. The system was not built for that kind of entry. Changing it would require a procedural amendment that would take time and internal discussion and the agreement of people who were not in this room. Orath was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "We will bring it to the full council. I will personally support the motion." Calvin said, "Thank you." Nora looked at him sideways and said nothing, but the expression on her face said quite a lot. 3 weeks later, the motion passed. Sarath became the first individual animal in the history of the Galactic Wildlife Conservation Ledger to receive a named personal entry. Not a specimen number, not a species notation. A name, a record of her life as far as it could be reconstructed, and a single line added by the Council at Calvin's suggestion. She used her last hours to ensure the survival of her child and the continuation of her species. Her contribution is permanent. On the day the entry was confirmed, Nora came to find Calvin in the care bay where he was finishing his afternoon rounds. She leaned in the doorway and told him the news and watched his face. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good." That was all. But his voice had something in it that was not his usual plain tone, something quieter and heavier and more careful, the way a person sounds when something they hoped for turns out to be real. Nora had been working on her documentation paper for weeks by that point, and she told him it was nearly finished. She said it was the most important work of her career, not because of the fame it might bring, which in xenobiology circles would be considerable, but because it documented something that had never been documented before and might not be seen again for a generation. "It should have 3 authors, Calvin said. Nora looked at him. "You," he said, "me, and Sarath." Nora looked at him for a long moment. Then she went back to her desk and changed the author line on the paper without another word. That evening, Calvin went to the station's observation platform the way he had been doing most evenings since Ember had arrived. The air was cooling fast the way it always did on Voreth after sunset, carrying the faint mineral smell of the distant ridge. The twin moons were coming up again, the same pale orange light that had been falling across the landing pad on the night the cargo sled came in low and slow and changed everything. He heard her before he saw her. The soft sound of claws on the platform railing, the small shift of weight settling into place. Ember climbed up beside him and sat on the railing, looking out at the same darkness he was looking at. She was noticeably larger than she had been even 2 weeks ago. Her flame crest was glowing with a steady, healthy warmth in the cooling evening air, and her scales had deepened further into that rich, dark color that the old survey photographs had never quite managed to capture properly. She looked strong. She looked like she belonged to the world she was sitting in. They stayed like that for a while, the man and the dragon, side by side on the railing in the evening air, not needing anything from each other except the simple fact of being present. Then Ember made a sound. It was low and quiet, more felt than heard, a soft vibration that moved through the railing and into Calvin's hands. He recognized it immediately. He had heard it first in a recording, and then once in a cold and silent room before dawn, from a mother who had just decided to trust a stranger with the most important thing she had. It was the greeting sound, the first sound Sarath had ever made to her hatchling, the sound that meant simply and completely, "I see you. You are here. That is enough." Calvin was still for a moment. Then he made the sound back. He did it quietly, imperfectly, the way a human makes a sound that was never designed for a human throat. It was not a good imitation. It was nothing close to what Sarath had produced, or what Ember produced so naturally. But Ember turned her head and looked at him. She held his gaze for a long moment with those calm, dark eyes that had been watching the world with steady attention since the very first night, since the moment she had pressed herself against a stranger's hand on the floor of a cold room and decided, in the way that very young creatures decide things, that this was someone she could stay near. Then she turned back to the stars. Calvin looked out at the ridge in the distance, at the dark volcanic outline against the night sky, at the place where a mother had fallen, and where something had survived that was not supposed to survive, because one person had said two quiet words at the right moment. Nobody had wanted her, and she had changed everything.